Most people heard about H.R. 38 and immediately jumped to the same conclusion. One federal gun law, national carry, everything changes overnight. That reaction is understandable because that's how the bill is often talked about online. But that isn't how the law actually works, and it definitely isn't how change happens in the real world. In the last video, I explained what H.R. 38 is and what it proposes to do. Now we need to go deeper, because this is where misunderstanding takes over. What would really happen if H.R. 38 passed? Not the talking points, not the hype, not the headlines, the actual legal chain reaction. Because passing a bill and reshaping how carry laws are enforced across 50 states are two very different things. The first thing to understand is what H.R. 38 would and would not do on day one. If H.R. 38 passed tomorrow, it would not erase state gun laws. It would not wipe out permit systems overnight. It would not create a single federal carry license, and it would not suddenly legalize carry everywhere. H.R. 38 is not a replacement for state law. It's a recognition mandate, and that distinction matters more than almost anyone realizes. H.R. 38 is built around one concept: recognition, not permission. Under the bill, if a person is legally allowed to carry a firearm in their home state, other states would be required to recognize that status when that person travels. That sounds simple, but legally it cuts straight into the core of how states have controlled carry for decades. Right now, states decide which permits they recognize, which they reject, and which conditions they impose. Some states recognize nearly everyone, others recognize almost no one. H.R. 38 removes that discretion and replaces it with a federal standard. That's the pressure point. States would still be allowed to regulate conduct. They could still set rules for sensitive places. They could still regulate how firearms are carried and handled, but they would lose the power to deny recognition outright. They could no longer say your permit isn't valid here or your home state doesn't qualify. And that single shift would ripple through every existing carry framework in the country. Once recognition becomes mandatory, enforcement becomes unstable. That's when the real legal conflict begins. Within days of H.R. 38 taking effect, lawsuits would be filed. Not hypothetical lawsuits, real ones. Individuals stopped while traveling, permit holders arrested under state law, civil rights organizations challenging enforcement, states suing other states, attorneys general stepping in on both sides. Every enforcement decision becomes a potential test case, and every test case creates risk for prosecutors and agencies. States would not openly defy H.R. 38. They never do. Instead, they would adapt the way they always have, by tightening everything around the edges. Sensitive place designations would expand. Technical violations would be enforced more aggressively. Minor mistakes would carry heavier penalties. The goal wouldn't be to ban carry outright, but to make lawful carry risky, confusing, and legally dangerous. We've already seen this strategy play out after Bruin, and courts are becoming increasingly skeptical of it. That's the second layer of H.R. 38's impact. It doesn't just change recognition, it drags the entire structure of state carry laws back into court. Once recognition is no longer discretionary, the next question becomes unavoidable. How far can a state go in restricting carry before it effectively nullifies recognition? Can a state recognize carry on paper but ban it in practice? Can sensitive place laws swallow recognition entirely? Those questions don't disappear if H.R. 38 stalls or faces resistance. They linger, they shape litigation, and they force judges to confront issues they've been postponing for years. This is where the Supreme Court inevitably comes back into the picture. Even partial enforcement of H.R. 38 would produce conflicting lower court rulings. One circuit upholds a restriction, another strikes it down, another carves out exceptions. That kind of fragmentation doesn't last long. When federal law collides with 50 different enforcement regimes, uniformity breaks down. And when uniformity breaks down, the Supreme Court gets pulled in whether it wants to or not. That's why H.R. 38 matters even if it never fully takes effect nationwide. It forces courts to deal with unresolved constitutional questions. It accelerates legal review. It destabilizes systems that rely on delay and ambiguity. And it does all of that without needing to instantly transform the law on day one. Another common question is whether states could simply ignore H.R. 38 if they don't like it. In theory, no. In practice, states resist through delay, interpretation, and selective enforcement. Agencies issue guidance instead of rules. Prosecutors exercise discretion. Enforcement slows quietly, but that strategy only works temporarily. Once a federal statute exists, every enforcement action becomes a liability. Every arrest tied to recognition becomes a lawsuit risk. Every prosecution becomes a chance to create binding precedent. And prosecutors understand that better than anyone. That's why, after Bruin, we saw enforcement slowdowns, dropped charges, and internal warnings. Not because the law vanished, but because the risk shifted. H.R. 38 would magnify that effect. Even limited enforcement would create uncertainty across the country, and uncertainty is poison for rigid regulatory systems. Permit regimes depend on predictability. H.R. 38 injects instability. This brings us to the political reality of why H.R. 38 hasn't passed. The bill doesn't fail because it lacks supporters. It fails because it forces lawmakers to confront federalism directly. Supporting H.R. 38 means acknowledging that states do not have absolute control over carry rights. Opposing it means defending a system where constitutional rights change the moment someone crosses a state line. That's an uncomfortable position, and it's easier to avoid the vote than to defend either side honestly. That tension is only getting sharper. As more states move toward permitless carry and others double down on restrictions, the gap between jurisdictions widens. H.R. 38 sits right at the center of that divide. That's why it keeps reappearing in different forms, across different Congresses, with slightly different language. The issue isn't going away because the underlying conflict hasn't been resolved. At its core, H.R. 38 forces the country to confront a question it has avoided for decades. Are constitutional rights portable, or are they conditional? Do they follow the citizen, or do they stop at the border? H.R. 38 doesn't answer that question by itself, but it makes avoiding it impossible. And once the question is on the table, courts eventually have to answer it. So no, H.R. 38 would not instantly create one national gun law, but yes, it would fundamentally disrupt how carry rights are treated across state lines. It would trigger lawsuits, strain enforcement, reshape prosecution decisions, accelerate judicial review, and push the system toward a more uniform standard whether states like it or not. The most important impact of H.R. 38 isn't what happens on day one. It's what happens over the next 5 to 10 years. Once recognition becomes a federal issue, carry stops being a local administrative question and becomes a constitutional one. And constitutional questions don't get resolved quietly or quickly. They move through courts, they create precedent, and they reshape enforcement slowly but permanently. That's why H.R. 38 isn't just another bill, it's a pressure test, and the system is already showing signs of strain. If you want to stay ahead of how this unfolds, this is exactly what we cover here. No hype, no panic, just the law, the process, and where it's actually headed. If this helped you understand what's actually happening with H.R. 38 and where this is heading, consider subscribing. This channel focuses on court decisions, federal law, and how these changes actually play out, without hype or panic. As this bill moves and the legal challenges start stacking up, I'll continue breaking it down step by step so you're not caught off guard. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next update.